Hi everyone, my name is Asan Ahmad, and on behalf of Pendulum Global, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on interdisciplinary competencies of the Republic of the Philippines. This webinar will be covering a vast variety of different topics in the Philippines, including the political infrastructure, to the economy, to the society of the Philippines. We hope that this video will act as an introduction to the country. So let's get started. In this slide, we're going to be talking about the current geography, the overall demography, the population growth concern, and the biodiversity concern. At the bottom corner of the slide, you'll note how we also have some country statistics that you can read that are actually very, very intriguing as well. So without further ado, let's jump into geography and demography. So the Philippines, officially known as the Republic of the Philippines, is a sovereign island country in the Southeast Asia, situated in the western Pacific Ocean. To the north, across the Luzon Strait, you can see Taiwan, so reference to the maps. West, across the South China Sea, you can see Vietnam, and southwest, you can see the island of Borneo across the Sulu Sea. And to the south of the Celebes Sea, you'll see it separates it from other islands of Indonesia. While to the east, it is bounded by the Philippine Sea and the island nation of Palau. As you'll note, Philippines is located on the Pacific Ring of Fire, close to the equator. And because for the Philippines is close to the equator and on the Pacific Ring of Fire, it is very prone to natural disasters such as earthquakes and typhoons. If you guys remember Typhoon Haiyan a couple years ago and how catastrophic that was. But it's also interesting to note that it also endows with abundant natural resources, and it also has the world's greatest biodiversity. Since the country is the third most disaster-prone country in the world, and this is after Palau and Vanuatu, it's very important for the country to have a lot of safeguard mechanisms in place as well. To go back to the statistics of the country, at approximately 300,000 square kilometers, the Philippines is the 73rd largest country in the world. And it has three main geographical divisions, as you can see in the maps: Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. Its capital city is Manila, while its most populous city is the Quezon City. As you'll note, the country has an estimated population of 97.35 million, with a density of 308 people per kilometer. Also, it is very important to note that the role of this rapid and unmanaged population growth in persistent income and human poverty cannot be overstated either. As you see in the basic facts of the country, the population growth is 1.9%. The population density, as we mentioned earlier, is 308 persons per square kilometer. But if you look at the poverty incidence, that's 25.2% of the total population. And if you look at the subsistence incidence, that's 10.4% of the total population. And also, if you look at the GDP index of 2013, it's 7. So, as we mentioned earlier, the role of the rapid and unmanaged population growth, in addition to the income and the human poverty, really needs to be focused on. With close to 100 million people and a population growth rate that's actually one of the highest in Asia, rapid population growth has exacerbated poverty and ultimately fueled rapid urban population growth, overseas labor migration, and unprecedented environmental degradation. Since the Philippines does have one of the highest amount of biodiversity, with all of the overexploitation of the resources and the pollution and global warming, it really does become a toxic atmosphere in the Philippines. For this slide, I'd like to focus on the flag analysis. So as you see on the flag, the three yellow stars stand for the primary island groups in the country. That would be Mindanao, Visayas, and Luzon. And the sun stands for freedom, unity, and autonomy. The sun, as you note, has 8 rays coming out of it, and each ray stands for one of the initial 8 provinces that initiated the Philippine Revolution in 1896. Those 8 provinces were Manila, Bulacan, Cavite, Nueva Ecija, Laguna, Batangas, Tarlac, and Pampanga. The red stripe stands for courage and patriotism, and the blue stripe stands for justice, peace, and truth. Something a bit interesting is the orientation of the flag makes a big difference upon the mood of the country. When the flag lies horizontally, the blue strip should be over the red, with the white triangle to the left. When the flag is vertically, the blue strip goes on the left, with the white triangle on top. However, the red and blue stripes switch in both the horizontal and vertical arrangements when the nation is at war, which means when the blue side is up, that means the nation is at peace. If the red side is up, that means the nation is at war. So understanding how the orientation of a flag is a representation of the mood of the country is very important for competency. I'd like to now focus on the history of the Philippines. It's hard to understand the present-day Philippines without knowing a little of its colonial history. And remember, colonialism as a whole has a very particular trend of exploitation, marginalization of the people, and a lot of post-colonial impacts of that act. So the first to arrive in the lands were the Malay settlers who bartered with indigenous tribes people, the descendants of whom now mostly live in remote mountain and even jungle areas. By the time the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, the islands had been trading with Chinese merchants for hundreds of years, and Islamic settlers from Brunei lived in the south of the archipelago. The Spanish turned these desperate islands into a nation, and their introduction of Catholicism had an impact, which continues to be felt today, with most Filipinos today identifying themselves as Catholics. Throughout the Spanish era, the mountain tribes struggled against colonial rule. A revolution began in 1896, but saw the Filipino forces defeated. They supported the United States in its 1898 war against Spain, but the conflict ended with the Philippines being sold to the Americans. The new occupiers were fiercely resisted for many years, but did improve standards of education and infrastructure. The Americans finally allowed elections in 1935, but just a few years later, the country became a major battleground during the Second World War. The Japanese army occupied the country, and many of the major cities, including Manila, were devastated. It's important to note that after the war, democracy was eventually restored, but it had a rocky path, for lack of better terms. In 1965, Ferdinand Marcos, he's a key player in this history, was elected president, and together with his wife Imelda, he set out to modernize the country and rein in the elite families, which had long dominated the Philippines. He declared martial law in 1972, strengthening his grip on power and ruthlessly crushing dissent, while also you can argue that it plundered the country's Marcos was disposed, however, or excuse me, was deposed in 1986 at the hands of a popular uprising led by another key figure in Philippine history, Cory Aquino, wife of the assassinated presidential rival Ninoy. Initial euphoria about a return to democracy turned to skepticism as successive administrations were accused of corruption, cronyism, and self-interest. Today, the wealth distribution remains very unequal and arguably is the impetus for a lot of these social inequities that we see and that we try to tackle, such as gender inequality, which goes some way to explaining the high number of Filipinos who do also work abroad and who send money back home. I'd now like to shift and talk about Philippine culture. And when I say culture, I don't mean the in-depth and the breadth of knowledge of culture, but I mean predominantly the religion and more so the social conventions. The religion, as we mentioned earlier, predominantly is Roman Catholic. 80.9% is Roman Catholic, and the rest are actually mostly Muslim. And there's other Christian denominations as well, and there are a demographic of Buddhists and Taoists as well. Again, if we look at the geographic location of the Philippines, you see that it is very easy for them to get these multiple different religious influences throughout history. And again, those religions do have an impact on the culture and on the ingrained philosophies of the country and the people. Focusing on social conventions, the government officials are addressed in the Philippines by their titles, such as senator or congressman or director. Otherwise, usual modes of address and levels of politeness are expected. You know, there is a mannerism to talk with your elders, very similar to that Asian concept of respect. Filipino men sometimes wear an embroidered long sleeve shirt or a plain white barong. Tagalog with black trousers for formal occasions, and women usually wear cocktail dresses or long gowns. The Philippines are, in many respects, very modernized than any other Asian country, really. But there is a rich underlay of Malay culture. This is really reflected, for example, in a concern for preserving amor propria, which is face, which makes direct confrontation a social taboo. And the last point that I'd like to touch upon is the language in the Philippines. Filipino, based on Tagalog, is the national language. Although it is the native tongue of less than a quarter of the population, believe it or not, English is widely spoken, and Spanish much less so. There are, however, which I found to be much interesting, a total of 170 indigenous languages in total, with hundreds different dialects. So again, you can really tell that a space has diversity and a space has a lot of subculture when you have different dialects, because there's always an origin to all of those dialects as well. Now let's talk about the tradition, the music, food, and some other topics about Filipino culture and tradition. So like we mentioned earlier, the culture of the country is really determined by the many colonial influences that happened throughout history. Most of these influences from previous colonization derive from Spain and the United States. Despite all of these influences, the old Asian culture of Filipinos has been retained and is clearly seen in the way of life, in their beliefs, and in their customs. Um, Wherever you go, you will note that Filipino culture is very evident and has largely been appreciated and even applauded in many parts of the world. It's quite unique and it's quite beautiful and it's very interesting to see. So I recommend, if you haven't seen it yet, go reach out to your local friend who's Filipino and ask them more about it too. I'm sure they'll give you some really great stories. The music is something that Filipinos are quite fond of as well, according to many, many cultural accounts. They use various materials to create sound, the performance of dance as well, such as tiniking and carinosa, and group singing during festive celebrations is also widely done and respected. Settlers from Spain introduced them to a variety of musical instruments, and those instruments are like ukuleles, trumpets, drums, and violin. So you really see how you have this really great fusion of Spanish and Asian mix. Most of their music also is contemporary, and they have also learned to write their own songs based on real life events. And this goes back to very ancient times, right? This 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 methodology of storytelling and narrative sharing, which also acts as a historical record keeping as well. Um, Again, this really does then segue into the concept of folklore, which was introduced actually by the early church and Spanish literature. It's interesting to also point out the social unit of the country, and that is really family. Family is really where a lot of social units gravitate around. The families include the intermediate family members, and that can be aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, and others outside, such as godparents and close friends. Many children have several godparents, and there is this close knit community amongst the people from the Philippines. And I think that really does go to show the interconnectedness in their lives. And in addition, that also does show a practice which was influenced by the first Chinese settlers in the Philippines as well, as these concepts are very, very Asian derived to predominantly from that Indo-China region. It's important to also note the distinctions amongst the house structures, because this really does reflect their status or area. As there are many positives to Asian culture, there is also this one part of Asian culture which I personally am not too fond of, but it is this stratification of individuals by their social and their economic status. Families in rural areas, they live in a nipa hut, which is made up of bamboo and roofed with leaves from palm trees or corrugated metal. And Filipinos that ranked as middle class, they live in homes made of bricks and stones. So this is a very common practice where you see the materials, and that is correlated with their status in the society as well. Another really interesting way to understand Filipino culture and to be competent in that whole social aspect of the Philippines is to understand the food that they eat. In terms of meals, we noted that Filipinos do enjoy food. They're a food-loving culture. But we note that the Philippines, since it is an Asian melting pot essentially, it is quite unique, and it is shown through the variety of their foods. Typically, foods include rice, and plain rice is sometimes matched with salted fish, chicken, and meat. Rice sometimes is served first, and there is a variety of ways to actually grow the rice and to cook and eat the rice. Um, and of course, food meals are throughout the whole day. It's morning, mid morning, lunch, afternoon, and dinner as well. To talk about some specific foods, they enjoy a variety of sweet foods in particular, and this is adopted from other countries, which encourage them to make their own desserts, like maja blanca, which is a dessert made of coconut milk, corn, sugar, or putu, and palitao, which are also made of coconut milk. They also enjoy eating halo halo for their afternoon snack, which means mixture, and it's a popular dessert that consists of layers of sometimes the cornflakes, ice cream, small pieces of gelatin, milk, and shaved ice. And during special occasions, of course, there are tradition dishes such as lechon, which is a suckling pig that has been roasted until the skin turns really crusty. And there's also another famous street food called balut, which is a boiled duck egg with an embryo and fish and squid on a stick that's dipped in spicy and sweet sauces as well. But the reason why I really do go into great depth about explaining all these things that might just seem very natural of every culture is that the Philippines has a very unique culture, but it's all due to the influences of colonialization and the surrounding countries. Overall, Filipino people are very hardworking, and they strive to make life better for the next generation of their family because it is a very family oriented culture. It's very respectful, it's very loving. The melting pot theory that is evident in this culture also makes this country very vibrant, exciting, and a diverse place to live and visit. So it's a great place. So I would love to go there one day and check it out. However, as we note in many places, there are areas of prosperity, but then there are areas that do get the short end of the stick, that are the product of consistent marginalization, exploitation, and overall multi-sector inequities. And that is what we are going to be focusing on continuing in the webinar training series. I'd like to now discuss regionalism in the Philippines and overall the impact of regionalism. Regionalism in the Philippines can actually be traced to its history and its geography. The Philippines, as noted in the maps in the previous slides, is separated from the rest of Asia by water. It is an archipelago with approximately 7,000 islands and islets, as we've seen from the maps as well. According to the Philippine Statistics Office, in 2000, the population of the Philippines was growing very, very, very rapidly. And what is intriguing to understand is that although the Philippines, had a total land area, as we noted previously as well, to be around 300,000 square kilometers, give or take 1,000 or 2,000 square kilometers, it is totally surrounded by water. So, because of its isolation by water from the rest of Asia, the Philippines has qualities unlike its Asian neighbors. It is the only Asian Christian nation, and it is a prominent democracy in Asia. Niels Mulder, who is a figurehead to really keep in mind, he observed the Philippines intermittently for 10 years and opines that the Philippines fail to demonstrate the cultural autonomy and depth of history to which he has grown accustomed in other Asian countries. just as reference, Mulder is a independent foreign anthropologist, and he was studying contemporary Southeast Asia. That's why his analysis about the different atmosphere in the Philippines is so important to incorporate in this discussion. Perhaps the Philippines is unlike its neighbors because of its physical separation from the rest of Asia and its colonial history. It's also really important to understand that there are often factors that we don't understand that can influence a particular country, and through time it's when we come to these realizations. So I'd also like to introduce the fact that there might be some unambiguous factors that we may be not considering as well that can play a significant role. Now let's focus on some general topics about the Philippines. The Philippines has a lot of bodies of water because it is an island in itself, but some examples are haze, rivers, lakes, falls, gulfs, straits, and swamps. Because it's an island and it has a coastline, there are a lot of natural harbors, and that introduces a lot of biodiversity as well. In terms of natural resources, the land is very fertile and arable, so it can allow for a lot of diverse growth of crops. The diversity of fauna is quite vast as well, and there are a predominant array of mineral deposits in the country as well. What is interesting is the government restricts exploitation of the natural resources. An example of this would be mining was banned. The country really wants to promote ecotourism. This is a very strategic move for the country because, as we know, we are in this green era, and saving your natural resources now can be very, very, very strategic, even economically, moving forward as we expunge resources in many current countries now, which are making a lot of profit currently due to those resources. In the next 30, 40, 50 years, those same natural resources will be worth a lot more. And for further development of the country, these resources will come in handy. Another really interesting topic to talk about is land. This is really the livelihood of the country because the land is so fertile, and its flexibility and ability to be used in agriculture and farming. The major agricultural crops of the country are corn, rice, coconut, abaca, and tobacco. And what also is quite interesting is how the majority of the products in the Philippines are exported, except for rice and corn. And another export, like we have noted here, are pineapples and bananas. That's actually one of the pineapples is a big staple one too. Even if you look at Filipino cuisine, the concept of sweet and pineapples is used quite often. Forests are very abundant in the Philippines. Actually predominantly in the area of Mindanao. 60% of the forested area of the entire country is found here, which is quite interesting as well. The country has a lot of lush and green forests. Again, this does further contribute to that great biodiversity that the country has. And again, to touch base about the mineral resources, except for petroleum and a number of metals, there's a lot of mineral resources abound in the Philippine soil. Mineral deposits can be classified into metals and nonmetals. The metal deposits are estimated at 21.5 billion metric tons, and some examples of metal deposits are nickel, iron, and white copper. Non-metal deposits are projected at 19.3 billion metric tons, and examples of those are cement, lime, asbestos, clay, guano, asphalt, feldspar, sulfur, talc, silicon, phosphate, and marble. So again, the Philippines is abundant in natural resources. Now let's focus on the economy and governance of the Philippines. Over the past decade or so, the Philippine economy has been described as resilient. Despite the global food and fuel crises, gross domestic product (GDP) peaked at 7.1% in 2007 and continued to grow at 3.8% in 2008. The country, while affected seriously by global rice price increases in 2007 and 2008, was much less affected by the global financial debacle as compared to other countries. GDP slowed to 0.9% in 2009, recovered to 7.2% in 2010, but decreased to 3.7% in 2011. At the end of 2009, the Philippines graduated to the rank of quote unquote lower middle income country, implying less resilience on aid and a better capacity to shape its own development. And I really want you to focus on the fact that because it is now a lower middle income country, having multi sector support and having funding for the development of the Philippines was not as an immediate responsibility anymore, right? Because those funds could be allocated to another country that needed them more. But at the same time, programs and development still did continue in the Philippines, but now, since it's under a new category, there's an entirely different protocol on how that's going to be handled. Performance of the Philippines in human development has also been respectable. It is classified as a medium human development index country and is ranked 112 out of 187 countries. So it's not all the way down, but it's not all the way up either. It's still in the hundreds. It's still very close to it's still closer to 187 than it is to. After 20 years of martial rule and a people power revolution in 1986, democratic institutions had been preserved, although imperfect, by a vibrant and vigilant civil society. The capacities of local governments have also steadily improved since the devolution of key revenue generating powers to provincial and city and municipal governments in 1991. I'd also like to mention how tight fiscal constraints, food insecurity, poor governance, and armed conflict have also been continuing challenges for the country. The critical fiscal constraint to growth has been weak revenue generation, specifically the national government's poor and even deteriorating tax effort. Inadequate investment in rural infrastructure and appropriate technologies, the slow development of labor intensive industries and agri based enterprises, questionable rice self sufficiency policies, and weak sector governance have, among others, caused a real productivity slowdown, for lack of better terms, in agriculture and the rural sector as a whole. Governance, as measured by the World Governance Indicator percentile rankings, has deteriorated since 1996, reflecting political instability, weakening control of corruption, decreasing regulatory quality, coordination failures, and continuing episodes of human rights violations. The Philippines is home to two of the world's longest running armed conflicts. That's something that isn't quite talked about often. The Moro and communist insurgencies. And the struggle for ownership of and access to ancestral domain by indigenous peoples, who comprise about 15% of the population, continues. An important fact is, while significant institutional gains have made as regards indigenous peoples' rights, the ancestral domain struggle continues to be a primary source of, of unpeace, for lack of better terms, in indigenous peoples' territories. So there is really an unevenness here. I'd like to focus on the political infrastructure of the Philippines. The Philippines political system takes place in an organized structure of a presidential, representative, and democratic republic, wherein the president is both the head of government and the head of state within a multi-party system. This system has three codependent branches. The first is the executive branch, which is the law enforcing body. The second is the legislative branch, which is the lawmaking body. And the third is the judicial branch, which is the law interpreting body. Let's go a little more in depth of each of the codependent branches. The executive branch has executive power is implemented by the government under the leadership president. Currently, the president is Benigno S. Aquino III. Second is legislative. The bicameral Philippine legislature, wherein members of both are elected by popular vote. The two-chamber Congress consists of the following. So we have first the Senate. The Senate or Senado or upper chamber consists of 24 seats, wherein one half are elected every 3 years, and members elected at large by popular vote to serve 6-year terms. They can be re-elected but they are no longer eligible to run for a third consecutive term. So the Senate is elected at large. The second part I'd like to point out, the House of Representatives. House of Representatives, or the Kapulangan ng Mga Kinatawan, or lower chamber, consists of 212 members, representing districts plus 24 sectoral party list members, and members elected by popular vote to serve 3-year terms. The Constitution prohibits the House of Representatives from having more than 250 members, and 206 are elected from the single-member districts. And the remainder of the House seats are elected for sectoral representatives, elected at large through the complex party list system, which is actually hinging on the party receiving at least 2 to 6% of the national vote total. And the third is the judicial branch. And the judicial branch of government is headed by the Supreme Court. It has a Chief Justice and its head and 14 associated justices, and they're all selected by the president on the recommendation of the Judicial and Bar Council, and they serve until they're 70 years old. And the Court of Appeals, which is Sandingan Bayan, is a special court for hearing corruption cases of government officials. Now, it seems like there are systemic checks and balances in place. And to really loop this all back into gender, it's important to ensure that we have both men and women on these branches. And it's very interesting to note that actually the previous president in the Philippines from 2000 to 2010 was actually a female. So the country in itself, although does need some work from the ground up, but from the top down, they think they've started to make a really conscious effort to be more inclusive to both genders. For this slide, let's focus on the lessons learned in achieving the Millennium Development Goals, focused on the Philippine experience. Now, the experience with and impact of the MDGs have actually been subject to numerous reviews and assessments by UN agencies and third-party agencies as well. Some of the more important points on which a consensus has emerged are the topics that I just want to cover in this slide. So far, in the discussions on the post-2015 UN Development Agenda, it's been noted that a lot of stakeholders have identified the format of concrete goals, targets, and indicators as one of the major strengths of the Millennium Development Goal framework as a whole, and that's one of the features that they want to retain moving forward in models for the Sustainable Development Goals for the next 15 years and whatever set of goals they have for post-2030 goals. Such a format implies that there is a clear framework of accountability, and that's the most important part actually. It's that accountability because it's based on clear and easy to communicate goals, and it's operational, and a couple other facts is that it's also time bound, and it has quantitative targets, and in addition to measurable indicators. Most MDG targets appeared realistic and achievable, so that also gave them an additional credibility. The focus on ends in the Millennium Development Goal framework was important also in giving a priority to human development in national development strategies, as each country has a national strategy. Incorporating the MDGs now made more sense because there was a cohesive and a collective initiative to do so. It made sense actually to retain the focus on ends in the post-2015 agenda, but the opportunity to address the issue of the means, without being prescriptive in a say, was something that really could have been missed. And so, essentially, without providing the blueprint, the post-2015 framework could, also include some general guidelines for policy orientation and coherence as well, and could also highlight some of the key success factors of effective development processes. So again, telling about best practices. It's really important to also note that for the Philippines in particular, current trends in elementary participation, survival, and completion rates suggested that the country may not achieve universal access to elementary education if if the factors that keep children out of school were not necessarily addressed. So essentially, unless children started to going to school and unless we figured out why students were unable to go to school, there was no way we could achieve the universal elementary education goal. The factors which were impediments included poverty, poor health, peace, and order problems, in addition to child labor. And in addition, what I found to be quite interesting is that efforts also needed to be focused on supporting boys to achieve gender equality in education, as the current gender gap appeared to be in favor of girls, which I find a bit interesting and actually a bit counter argument from what we've been talking about before. But it's interesting to note how there's some spaces that really do talk about how there's some regions where there is a vast amount of girls who are receiving the education and the boys aren't. So again, gender is a two-way street, and it goes for, well, arguably it is a multi-way street, but definitively it's definitely two-way that we're familiar with, the boys and the girls. Now, let's also focus on, actually, I think that sums it up for this this slide. Let's continue to the next one. The building blocks, per se, are structured in the form of 4 principles and 5 pillars that we'll mention in the next slide, as well as enablers for realizing the development agenda. The Philippines was actually chosen to conduct a national consultation on the post 2015 global theme, which was on population dynamics. And so in March 2013, there was a collective of 100 key stakeholders. They gathered together to discuss how population dynamics could be addressed and how it should be addressed in the post 2015 development agenda. And what they found was that using the findings and data of the National International Conference on Population and Development as a reference point, as reference points, they discussed how population growth, population aging, urbanization, migration, all constituted important developmental challenges and potential opportunities. And there were many recommendations for policies and programs which are actually very rights based, and they promote gender equality as well. So I'd like to then discuss the four principles that were embedded in the UN Charter and 1987 Constitution for the Philippines. And this really does hold the foundation for the agenda, and those 4 points are human rights, equality, equity, people empowerment, social cohesion and justice, accountable governance, and sustainable and inclusive development. In addition, to reflect the specific development challenges of the country, 5 pillars were identified as the areas where progress is most needed to build a rights-based, equitable, and sustainable society. So these 5 pillars, or we can reference them as themes, were poverty reduction and social inclusion, environmental sustainability, climate change and disaster risk management. 3, accountable, responsive, and participatory governance. 4, fair and stable order based on international rule of law. And 5, being peace and security. And it's important to point out that these are all well thought out and coherent policies, and but there is a need for more that will really be required to achieve the goals and objectives which ultimately define that will be defined within these pillars. Um, so to keep in mind that there may be a lot more points that we may need to be discussing. And a lot of those points also do cover points such as freedom of information, anti-corruption, electoral reform, fiscal reform and consolidation, knowledge management, good government, people's participation in decision making, like a fair trade policy, competition policy, adequate financing for development, social bridging and social budgeting, gender responsive planning and budgeting. That's something that's very important as well. Income asset redistribution, which also includes land reform. Also, access to information technology. Like we mentioned earlier, this is the 21st century. And again, this does then introduce a lot of other reforms that should be done, such as banking, monetary reform, fiscal reforms, the concept of a social enterprise, and something that the Philippines, although are doing perhaps not intentionally, but through their conservation of their natural resources due to their immense biodiversity, really focusing on this green economy would be quite fruitful for them in the future, in addition to conservation, protection, and rehabilitation of environment and natural resources, like we mentioned earlier, and the transition to a climate-smart development as well. But most importantly, to sum all of this up, there should also be a peace agreement, such as justice on wheels, going everywhere, and engendering the judiciary And most importantly, something that is lacking in many countries where we know that there becomes internal problems and external problems as well, is the lack of social dialogue. So by having social dialogue that can really act as a an asset for the country, because with the dialogue, that's when you solve the most pressing problems. So thank you for watching this webinar, and keep watching the other ones as well. Thank you.